My name is Dalal. I've been an educator for 18 years now. I started out as an English language and literature teacher, went on to become an IB DP language A teacher, a DP coordinator, and I am currently a teacher educator with the Queen Rania Teachers Academy. I'm on a pre-service diploma known as the teacher education professional diploma. Not working. Shut up. Okay. Battery change. In the meanwhile, the reason I came up with this title, and I'm aware it's a long one. I've heard quite a few comments on this being the longest title among all the sessions in the catalog. That's great, that's good to hear. The reason it's such a long title is there are quite a few things I want us to think about today. And to really bring everything together, looking at the session outcomes, I'm only interested in focusing on these. I want us today to look at how can we make teaching literature into a process inside the classroom, rather than looking at it as a time for the teacher to play expert and tell students what literature is all about. I want our activities inside literature classrooms to be student-driven, to be student-led. I would also like to suggest, and have you suggest, routines that you can use inside your classrooms when teaching literature, when teaching and looking at texts. And finally, I want us to think about how can we turn our learners, our students, into autonomous, independent learners who are capable of grappling with this text, living with the frustration, accepting failure, and then to go on and produce new knowledge based on what they've done and what they've seen. So I asked those of you who came in a bit earlier to tell me why you're here. I'd like to hear from a couple what you're looking for from this session. Any volunteers? Please.
Well, first of all, I'd like to honor also language and literature teacher. And just the word literature, interpretation. I love literature, the whole 9 yards about it. But I also am very much interested to see in something that you mentioned, how can you make it more student-led? How can you create that ambiance of, yeah, this is a book that is important and why. So interpretation is why. So the whole scope of this version is
Very happy to hear that. Anyone else with maybe also a specific question? I'm here because I'd like us to try and think about this, or to try and grapple with this. No specific questions yet? Well, I'm going to come back and ask you for specific questions at the end of this session. So I'm hoping that as we discuss things, do keep a critical mind. Look at what we're talking about. Consider how it might work in your context. Consider what issues you might face, and consider what ideas you might want to try out with other people. So that's where the outcomes are concerned. Let's look at a theme for the conference. Agile minds, turning tides. Very lofty. Something we all aspire to. We go into the classroom and we think, well, yes, I want my students to be agile thinkers. I want my students to go on and change the world. I want them to view themselves as change agents. So how does that apply to the literature classroom, do we think? A lot of the time, how many of us have been in literature classes where the professor or the teacher is up here lecturing, saying, this is how we read this text by Shakespeare. These are the important themes. This is how you can see the character. Now go off, read what I've told you, come back, and regurgitate it. How many of us have had this experience? And they've been the most boring, the least interactive sessions we've ever been in. And what they've taken away, I'm glad you said what you did at the beginning,
what they seem to take away is the passion we feel for literature. We are literature teachers because we love the text, because we see it as an extension of what is out there. So that brings us to, how is it that we can see the text as a metaphor for life? If we're asking our students to consider the text and negotiating a text as a skill that they need, or when do they need it? Every single day. Looking at texts and learning how to deal with them, how to question them, how to make sense of them, how to reorder that information to make new sense of the world around us, this is what literature should be about. It is not about the canon. It is not about students knowing every single thing they need to know about 14th century poetry. That's not what we're here for. And I would hope that's not what students go into literature for. So think about these. What metaphors have you used in your own teaching? As a teacher of language or literature, what metaphors have you used in your classroom? Why would you try to get your students to make the connection you've made? If you use a metaphor, you've made a connection between two dissimilar things. Why make this connection? In my case, when I was a young teacher first starting out, I would tell my students, literature is life. And now anytime I meet graduates, oh, yeah, I remember you. You're the one who always says literature is life. Why am I interested in getting my students to see the connection between literature and life? Finally, how do you get them to do that? How do we, in our teaching, inside the classroom, in introducing students to this weird and wonderful world of literature, get them to see the connection we want them to see? So I'd like you to take a couple of minutes and, in your groups, share a metaphor and try and answer a couple of those questions together. I'll give you 2 minutes. Fihon. So we've had time to share thoughts, ideas, and apparently there's a very good metaphor over there that someone needs to copyright. Am I correct? So what's the metaphor that they feel you should copyright?
So I teach a lot of different subjects, literature as well. I'm actually a theory of knowledge coordinator, and so this one kind of applies really to any discipline, but it's about an argument. And so like, my definition of an argument is a claim plus support. And it's integral to support, because a claim without support is meaningless. So the metaphor is that a claim is like a table. It's something solid that's only as good as the support. And you can only accept or reject a claim based on how strong the support is. So if your support is weak, I can come in and kick it out, and the table falls to the floor, it ceases being a table on the floor, and I can step all over it.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And we also had another wonderful idea here where literature is synonymous to words like joy. And another teacher says, no, you know what? Literature is you. Literature is this whole experience of human life and what we do with it and how we are to go on and live. And all of these ideas, do keep them in mind. And let's see how it is that rather than coming into class thinking, today I'm going to teach Paradise Lost, I'm going to go into class and think, today I'm going to share with my students the joy of reading a text. I'm going to share with my students how they can see themselves in the text they're looking at, in the text they're exploring. And I'm going to help my students make claims that they can support. And all of this is where we're going with turning the literature classroom into a place that becomes interactive, a place that becomes less about teacher writing, student copying, and more about student arguing with other students, teacher listening in, guiding, supporting. So I have a couple of quotes up here. The first one says, I give students the background information and then ask them to read the story, identify how they found the information, how it helped them understand the text. How many of us have done that in our classrooms? What assumption is this making about my role as a teacher? It's an interesting one, huh? We all do it. It works. My students give me wonderful essays that explain the context of accidental death of an anarchist. Wonderful essays. Have they understood? I don't know, maybe not. The second quotation reads, I did read it at home, but I didn't understand anything. It's easier to wait until the teacher tells us what it's about. She chooses really hard poems. It's like she thinks we're like her. Let me confess. First quote is a quote, it's mine, my words. This is me, 10 years ago. The one at the bottom is one of my students. And when that happened, it was a moment where I had to stop and really look at what I was doing, what I expected from my students, and what they're leaving my classroom with. So it's a moment of failure, and I want you to keep this in mind, this word failure, because when we say it, we tend to say it, in an almost retiring manner. I don't want to confess that I failed. How can I, a teacher, the expert, the one they're depending on, have failed? But I'm making the assumption that I need to be the expert. There's that word again. I need to be the one to provide the information. I need to be the one to guide them towards one explanation that I'm looking for. That single correct reading of the text I'm providing. And that's where things tend to fall apart. Why? This workshop is actually based on the work of Sheridan Blau. And if you're interested, the text is up here. You can always look it up, and I would recommend reading it. He talks about the importance of turning the literature classroom into a place where analysis is seen as a process, just like it is when teaching writing. And he says, the experience of learning, in reference to his undergraduate students, the experience of learning was mine, not theirs. They were, to a very large extent, merely witnesses to it. So students would come into the classroom, The teacher is prepared. How many of us sit and read and research, and we have all this information that we go into the classroom with, whether it's language or literature or TOK, whatever it is we're teaching. And we assume that now that I've done the work, my students are just going to see it. It will magically transfer from my mind to theirs. And what happened this morning, and I'm so very happy to have sat in on a session just before this one and listening to the keynote speech earlier today, because they connected very well with my own journey. What we're not paying attention to is the fact that understanding is a performance. We want them to perform their understanding so that we can actually see what's going on. We don't want them to parrot what we're saying. So that's one thing. Another thing is what we tend to do. We break things down, don't we? We have a poem. We give them the meaning of every single word that's unfamiliar. We identify for them the metaphors, the similes, the personification examples.
We don't do that. We have sentences to come up with. We don't tell them this word means this or this, or we ask them to look for metaphors. We ask them to look for similes. We don't give it to them.
Good. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. When you ask them to look for metaphors and similes, are you directing them towards a certain passage or a certain place in the poem or the text? Are you asking them to look for a specific keyword like is? Look for is, that's where the simile is. Or look for two things that aren't similar, the metaphor is. Look for two things that aren't similar, underline them, see how they're presented. We're guiding them so closely, sometimes, subconsciously. And at times, I'm not saying it's not good practice, because it helps our students understand what goes beyond, to understand how to deal with the structure. But is it always the way to get students to themselves identify, well, this isn't really working for me in the text. I don't really understand this. Where's this coming from? And I'm not saying we shouldn't at all guide students in understanding how to take a text apart. But as Tina Blythe pointed out this morning, when we take it apart into so many little pieces and break it down so far that students are unable to see it in the context, are unable to get a holistic view, that's when things become a bit dicey. It works for our assessments, right? Because in assessments, you bring part of a text sometimes, you ask them specific questions, or you want them to recognize in an unseen text, you want them to look for specific examples. They're assessed on that, so we teach that. So we do it in our classrooms, but it doesn't always work when we're thinking of the big picture. When we're thinking of taking our students beyond this classroom and having them grapple with the world that is the text that they need to negotiate. It's not so much what we give them in class that's important at this point. It's the skills we give them when we teach them how to deal with what they have in front of them that will matter. To help them to sail. Wonderful quote, wasn't it? Also from this morning. Trying to get them to negotiate this. Yes, sorry.
Actually, almost I remember when we teach the students that if it is the first lesson, we need to know how they read, sit with these and how like they approach. However, when they meet in the game, when I'm sure they are ready to have this space, they need to do it at a sense. Like it is a thing that I'm sure they will be asked. I should be leading down like
Thank you for saying that. So let's have a little experiment, right? So there are times when you need to be the leader. I'm sorry, your name? Sosan points out that there are times when you need to be the leader in class because your students come in and they don't have that knowledge that you have about literature. So you want to guide them, you want them to look at certain things, you want them to focus on certain issues, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a poem. And what I would like you to do, yes, can we switch off the AC, please? The poem we'll be looking at is the first one. It's called Email from Scheherazade, and it is by a Syrian American, if you could pass these down, please. Syrian American poet known as Muhja Kaf, and I do have the collection up here if you'd like to see it before you leave. This is what we're going to do. So let's instructions for a minute, and then I'm going to leave you all alone with the text. You're going to read the poem not once, not twice, but 3 times. After each reading, and you will do this individually, after each reading, I would like you to rate how well you understand the poem, with 0 being not at all, and 5 being very well or perfectly, if you like using that word, which personally I don't. But 5 being you've reached a level of understanding that you think is top-notch. After you do that, we're going to discuss what happened with your understanding, which is why the next 2 activities come in. So after the first and during the first and second reading, I want you to take note of what puzzles you. What questions do you have on this poem? What interests you? What lines do you like? After the third and last reading, you're going to do something else in addition to that. You're going to then write a statement reflecting on your understanding. You've rated it 3 times now. What do you notice about each time you've rated the poem? Does it go up? Does it go down? Does it stay the same? What do you notice about the things that you've noticed? What do you notice about the questions you have? And finally, I do want questions. I'm sure we're all going to have questions. So do write any questions you have. And please, there is no such thing, as we always tell our students, there is no such thing as a stupid question. Okay? So please, you have 15 minutes. Off you go. So most of us seem to have completed the 3 readings. Anyone still needs a bit more time? Okay. Should have expected that from teachers. So, look at what you have. Let's reflect. Has anything changed from reading 1 to reading 3? Please, share with us. Thank you. So, you focused on things that the first reading might not have been too clear. You used prior knowledge. You made connections. And for you then, it made more sense, the second and the third time. Anyone else? So you were able to focus your concentration during the second and the third reading, while the first reading was lacking in that focus, in that concentrated focus, I should say. Thank you very much. Thank you. So recognition of, how much did I tell you about the poem, about the poet, sorry? She's Syrian, right? That's all I told you. And yet, you were able to make that connection, right? Syrian living in America. So let's talk now a little bit about the text. What questions do you still have on the text? Yes?
Why Hackensack, New Jersey? Hackensack, of all places.
So why Hackensack, New Jersey? Please.
If I'm a 16-year-old and I don't have background knowledge, I would ask you who's Scheherazade.
Thank you. Who are these people? Who's Scheherazade? Who's Shahriyar? So what would I normally do as a literature teacher? I'd normally do what? What would you do?
I would tell them to look for them, see who they are. I wouldn't give the answer.
So would you do it before class? So before you come to class, go look for it?
No, I would, it depends. I mean, if it's a novel they're reading, I would say look for the time when the book was written and what's the political background for that. And then we start. So I established the prior knowledge. So I don't know about the poem, but yeah, no, I think the poem I would read it first and then we would tackle it. So it depends, I guess, on the text.
Thank you. So let's consider this. You've read. Someone might still have a question. Someone might not know in your classroom who Scheherazade or Shahriyar are. What can we do at this point? Well, how about showing just a little video explaining just that story? Or giving them a text to read. Who Shahriyar is, who Scheherazade is, the background. Okay?
One thing I just have been speculating.
Yes. Thank
Kind
you.
of predictions to the best. It also hits stronger that way. If you're right, you're going to be proud of yourself. If you're wrong, you're going to be hard on yourself. And then, so you're kind of comparing and contrasting. If you just go and research it, it doesn't stick. But if you speculate and make predictions what you think, then you bring it back to yourself.
Thank you very much. So I'll just make a point and then all your ideas are going to be very valuable and we will share all the ideas. So when we're talking about what do we do first and what information I'm getting them and how I'm guiding them towards understanding, what we're missing out of is giving them that option to say, you know what, this is interesting. This name is strange. How do you even say it? I didn't know this combination of letters worked together. If we're talking about the joy, if we're talking about negotiating what's out there, if we're talking about getting students to take charge, then we want that curiosity to be inside our classrooms. If we give them before class a text on Scheherazade and Shahriyar and 1001 Nights and what it's all about, and then we give them the poem, or we stand there and we tell them who they are, and then we give them the poem, it's not wrong. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's going to lose us something. It's not going to be to arise out of our students' natural curiosity. It's not going to get them to feel, this is something worth looking into. It's not going to have them racing home and saying, did you know that there's this story about this crazy guy who is killing women every night? And stories actually saved them? And if we want that in our students, then let's activate that curiosity. Any other comments about, yes?
I think in literature, this is one of the steps that we are looking for as teachers. Let the students know that inspiration that literature inside one's meaning to lead my students and exist upon us, I don't know, leaders upon us, which means that to bring something from history or something from culture and put it inside the poem. So the students will explore the poem through this. So it is very important that I believe that my students know very well what Scheherazade and Shahriyar, so they will connect this with that.
Thank you. And what we're talking about here is intertextuality and the importance of getting students to recognize these references or to be curious enough to look them up. Thank you very much. Yes?
I wonder, some of them will feel involved trying to research for something. Others
won't.
You feel ready.
So let me ask you, working in groups together, and if we had more time, I'd say, next step, share with each other your reading of the poem. Share with each other your experience of. When students work in groups together in this way and come up with answers for some of those questions, or discover, you know what, This person doesn't know it either. Is that such an alienating feeling for a student? You think so? Interesting. Okay, so let's see. We're going to do another activity with a short story where I'm going to come back and ask that question again. So do keep it in mind. Yes?
True. I don't expect them all to enjoy this.
Fair enough. Good point to make. Yes?
I think I want to focus on the language. I want to add to I really also what you said about the fact that students feel alienated. I think that in a way that they will, that's part of that collaboration where you're encouraging discourse. So if rather than one feeling alienated, then they're all feeling alienated, and that in itself creates sort of a collaborative bonding of the reading of that poem. And another thing with regards to like if we're looking at GP students, particularly TOK, that's a great opportunity for students to bring in prior knowledge or ways of knowing and how they approached that poem. That in some cases discourse.
Thank you. And that's what, let's see how well that works with our next activity. We'll be looking at a short story. So just for my own, to slake my own curiosity, how many enjoyed reading this poem? How many had heard of this poet before? How many just didn't like it, didn't think it was worth anything? No? Who's the poet? Mohja Kaf, a Syrian-American poet. She writes in English, yes. Interesting perspective. So for you, well, this is something that's repeated. This is not new. It's the same old, same age-old issue. Well, let me ask you, is this still a question that we deal with today? Is it still an issue that we discuss? Is it still something that as women we might, it being Women's Day and all, we might look at more closely? You could.
Did she choose this title just to make it sound more like up to date or to listen to the students? I'm not sure about the title. Towards the end, like the language starts to be more attractive, towards the end, it's harder to
Fair enough. So for you, your perception of the poem changed towards the end. You were drawn by that ending. What drew you about how the poem ended? Can I ask someone? Thank you very much. So we understand that the political, the political reference maybe here. To us it means something different. Who read it differently, this line? Who read this line differently? I come from a place where words can kill you.
Well, considering that she's very political climate, how often it's very hard to actually speak out against things that are wrong.
So, but would it be possible for someone to read it differently? Why? Another perspective. Right? So we've had a mini conversation. Again, because of time, we're doing things in quite a rushed manner. But we've had a mini conversation that might help you reflect on these two questions. What was my role in this activity as a teacher? What did I do? Yeah, I like someone said nothing.
give us kind of to get us any information. You just let us speak up.
Thank you. And I am aware that we didn't have the time necessary so that you can, in your groups, discuss, but this is one of the precepts. This is what I believe in as a literature teacher, and I'm sure TOK teachers and language teachers and all educators believe in this. It's through collaborative learning that deep learning can take place. So giving students this opportunity inside the class to grapple with something, to look at it more deeply, to identify what questions they have, to then share those questions with others, to try and come up with answers. And this is why I usually share this with my students after we do an activity similar to this. So we do an activity like this, and of course, throughout, they're not as patient as you are. Miss, this is too hard. Miss, you have to give me the answer. Miss, what's going on here? Come on, please. And they just refuse sometimes to accept that it's okay. It's difficult to understand. Do read it over and over. See what you come up with. So if I'm looking at a process for looking at interpretation, right, we have to start at a point of confusion. If students are aware that they don't know enough, and I'm sorry about the AC, we did ask them to raise it, but apparently they can't turn it off. They can only raise the temperature. Thank you. So we start at a point of confusion, and this point of confusion becomes that learning opportunity. It's the point where you can get them to be curious. It's the point where you can get them to ask those questions. They should recognize that it's okay to feel frustrated. Struggle and frustration are part of this process, and they should embrace them. At this point, they need to be able to ask, what don't I know? What questions do I have? Because it's by asking questions, it's by recognizing what questions I'm going to answer, that they're able to then concentrate their focus. As readers of literature or as teachers of language, you do this. Who reads a text only once? Not a single person here. We read it twice, 3 times, 4 times, and every time we reread, we focus on something. We answer a question, we ask another. And yet, we expect our students to recognize this without uncovering it for them. We expect our students to reach the conclusions we've reached without telling them, look, try it out. What works for you? What's happened with you when you've done this? Reflect on that. Think about it. That's why I was very adamant about looking at this as a process. After that, we reread. This time we're concentrating our focus. And we work with clues. We use our prior knowledge. We can look up, use our phones, research. And if you notice, we're going from identifying questions to trying to find our answers. We're asking our students to metacognate. We're asking our students to think about their thinking. And this is a skill that they will transfer. This is a skill that they will need to negotiate the world. We follow that with rereading yet again. But this time, we discuss. Let's share. Let's see what questions you have. Let's see how I saw it. Let's see if you can help me with this. Sometimes at this point in the process, students will tell me, you know, I thought I understood. I gave myself a 4, but after talking to others, I've gone down to 3 because I think there's something here that I misunderstood. And we want them to do that. Finally, we ask them to write, to reflect through writing, because writing helps make this understanding visible. And through it, we evaluate and we reflect. And what I like to do with my students is I ask them to share their writing with each other, and I ask them to respectfully challenge each other. As in, answer this question, is it plausible, this interpretation that your colleague has given? Whether you agree or not, is it plausible? Does it have explanatory power? Does what the student has written come from clues in the text? Does it make sense in the text as a whole? So now we're going to look at a short story. This time, you're going to read the story silently. This is the individual portion. After which, we're going to read it out loud in a popcorn style, meaning just take over and read whichever part takes your fancy. Finally, the third reading is going to be you shouting out which lines you think, or which lines specifically, you think is the most important, is the most puzzling, a line that you question, you disagree with, a line that you feel is powerful. And after that, we will come back together and see what perspectives we have. Thank you. Okay. You will then write about the line you've shouted out. And if you need paper and pen, do let me know. You will write about the line you're shouting out, answering this question. Explain why this line is the most important, or the most puzzling, or the most interesting. Note the use of the word most. It has to be a line that viscerally captures your attention. Okay? And then we're going to share our writings in your groups. You're going to share with your partner. And you're going to see whether you have similar or dissimilar views, what you think of what your partner has written. And we'll come back together and share our experience by reading what you nominate in your group. Nominate one reading as the one that strikes you worth hearing. This is something that the whole class, as it were, or that everyone here should hear. Any questions? Then let's go. Thank you. So it's very important because we have here Arabic literature teachers. And I'm so happy that you came because we don't often think of how our students react to texts we choose. And I've made it a point to choose texts that I don't think you'll be familiar with, authors that are generally not taught in the mainstream, because I want you to try and enter into this confusion. And the confusion is very obvious with this text specifically. We have clues, but we don't know what's going on up until we read it again and again, and then suddenly it clicks. Oh, so when she's talking about the buffalo, she's asking her daughter how many months along are you? And it's the ambiguities of texts, when we are familiar with them, does not strike us when we put them in front of our students. So a lot of the time when I ask teachers, how do you choose your text? They say, well, I took a whole course on, Macbeth, and that's why I'm teaching Macbeth. That's the worst reason you could give for choosing to put Macbeth on the curriculum. Because if students don't see you struggling, if students don't see you failing and trying and rereading again and making sense with others, they're not going to do it. We were talking about modeling a bit earlier. This is the modeling, right? So going through a text, choosing a poem off of, a site that you've never read before, and going through an activity like this with your students in class, okay? That's where you show them it's okay not to know. Because accomplished readers reread, and reread again. And they start making connections. And they start identifying what they don't know. And they start identifying what point in the text do things change. They start making also the connections within the text itself between a word, an action, an attitude. And that's where our students then start to engage. So again, I would ask the question, what was my role? As a teacher, what was your role as students? And besides trying to help a group by asking specific questions, so what do you think happened here? Well, can you go back to that? So what do you think of this? To help them make sense of a specific point, I step back. Has it worked? I don't know, you tell me. It is a different approach. Yes, thank you. That's a very important point to make. When we struggle as teachers, students accept that struggling is part of the process. But if I'm the expert, and that's what my student showed me with her quote, you know, miss, I'm not you.
The question is, how often have we even tried doing assignments with you?
Thank you.
Teachers have taken the assessment. It's rough. Some of the stuff is rough. It's hard.
Yeah, I mean, and when you look at what they have to do, it's like,
it's demanding. It's challenging. And you actually take one of those assessments, like,
What do? Like 48 hours after the test, when we get the paper, we lock ourselves in our office and we start trying to decipher this question and coming up with all these answers, because then we want to go up to them and say, well, this is how you were supposed to do it. But it's okay not to know, because we're teaching them how to negotiate life. And when we negotiate life, we start with confusion and we don't know the answers. So to bring everything together, going the wrong way, sorry. To bring everything together, when we're talking about creating a classroom culture of student-centered interpretive discourse, we need three things. We need to have students wonder about what does it say, then go on to ask, well, what does it mean? To finally come to, what does it matter? And that's what we try to do with our activities, with reading several times. First time, we read silently, trying to see what's in the text, identifying what we don't know. Then we read communally. Let's recognize where we like it. And I know you felt, why are we doing the popcorn style? But towards the end, everyone wanted a chance. Everyone wanted to jump in. And everyone was listening and paying attention. And believe me, it's the same in class with my students. The first few times, no one wants to read, they're looking up, and then they start gaining interest because they want to prove something to themselves and to others. And they want to read their favorite parts, and they want to say why they're their favorite parts. So we are looking at three things, and I'm sorry it's not too clear, but when you do get the PowerPoint, you'll be able to see all the words. So we're looking at contextual literacy, intercontextual literacy. Okay, so contextual, what's in it, what does it mean, how do I make sense of it? Intercontextual, what are the references? How does context play into it, like the Scheherazade poem? Knowing about that helps you understand the text better. And more importantly, dispositions. We need to build in our students, and IB teachers, we all talk about the learner's profile, right? Well, we need those same dispositions inside our literature classrooms. We need our students to be able to focus their attention when reading. We need our students to be risk takers, to share what they've written, to feel it's okay to have different opinions than others. We need our students to be willing to embrace confusion, to see confusion as an opportunity, because that's how we see it as teachers of literature. We enjoy it when we don't understand something in a text. We go and look it up. We go and research further. And we want our students to have that same attitude. We want them to be metacognators. We want them to think about their thinking, think about their learning, think about the process that goes into understanding. And finally, we want them to be willing to tolerate failure. Failure means I'm learning. And again, as Tina Blythe said this morning, what her grandmother is saying, if something is worth doing, it's worth doing poorly. Because by doing it poorly the first and the second time, I'm uncovering the complexities. I'm able to see how I can do this well, and I'm able to grow and to share things. And I'm leaving you, I'm right on time, I'm leaving you with this quotation, which talks about really another definition of understanding. This is by Judith Langer, and if you've read research in teaching literature or teaching language, she's one of the people whose writing is worth reading. She says, reading is an experience of envisionment building, of growing understandings that change over time. Envisionment building is an act of becoming, where questions, insights, understandings develop as the reader progresses, while understandings that were once held are subject to modification, reinterpretation, and even dismissal. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Agile Mindset. This is what we want our students to be able to do. So hopefully, these few ideas that we've talked about today will help you, by taking them back into the classroom, help your students become agile thinkers and learners, become people who can negotiate this world in a way that allows them to succeed in it. And thank you for coming today. Thank you.